social injustice. Now, in relation to all these phenomena or crises, empathy, or rather the lack thereof, perhaps, plays an important role. And as this sort of pill for, empathy seems to be the magical word, the remedy, to create, as it says here, the side effects are courage, hope, peace, and it needs heart, a good dose of heart, and eggs, I mean literally eggs, but I guess balls, courage to do that. So, but I think, as you have seen from the various titles of sessions, we're also critical about that. I think there are some problems with looking or fostering empathy all of the time. We had good discussions on that already yesterday. What are the sort of dark sides of this? So let me just, before Markus Wild will talk about the concept and some of its analogues, over the past, yesterday also some of its analogues came up. Why did he call it compassion? Would sympathy be better? Understanding, love even, maybe, though that seemed a bit corny to use that term. So I just want to thank you for coming to this conference, for your curiosity, I think, about other perspectives on the topic, for your openness and attention to each other, which can all be summed up. Thank you for your empathic engagement. So then I lead over to Markus Wild, who is the co-chair of this conference, as mentioned. He is professor of theoretical philosophy since 2013 here. And his main focus is the philosophy of mind, and especially animal philosophy. It's too hot for his dog Titus to come tonight, but he's known for the professor who brings his dog to the classroom, so that to also really see the other there, and not just talk about an object somewhere. I won't say whether he's, well, no. Now, he started his career in early modern history of philosophy, and now he mainly works in the philosophy of mind, as mentioned, the philosophy of ethology and animal ethics. And the title of his talk is Empathies and Perspectives. You don't have a PowerPoint? No? Good. Well, we read. See the other there, and not just talk about an object somewhere. Started his career in early modern history of philosophy, and now he mainly works in the philosophy of mind.
Thank you very much, Manuela. And welcome in Basel, and welcome to this conference from my side as well. I'm very much looking forward to our discussions and exchanges ahead. We had a very promising start yesterday. I've been participating in the workshop on animals and empathy, and as I have heard, the other workshops have been also very exciting and rewarding. I hope that you will feel comfortable and at ease during these 4 days here in Basel, despite the rather demanding weather conditions. But some of you already told me that you like heat, so there are different ways of adapting to the environment, obviously. As Manuela said, I usually have my dog with me, Titus. I take him to the university. He is present in all the talks, in all the seminars. And this morning I asked Titus whether he wanted to go to Basel during these 4 days. Well, he preferred rather not to. He said it's too hot, and he has too much wool. I was slightly panic-fueled to go here on my own. So what was I supposed to do without my dog? And Titus gave me the following advice. He said, start talking, faint after 5 minutes, and everybody will feel empathy and concern for you. Mission accomplished. I acknowledge I was tempted by this suggestion, but then I wasn't too happy with this advice, because I went to share some philosophical thoughts with you about the concept of empathy, and I start in a minute. And I wanted to do something else, something I think is very important for me, at least. So first things first. As you have seen, there are many persons involved in the preparation of this conference. However, there is one person who involved all the other persons as she did in my case, and without whom this conference would not even have started. Of course, you know whom I'm talking about, so I'd like to thank you, and I ask you, please join me. I'd like to thank Manuela Rossini for building up this meeting. Okay, what I'm going to do now is to talk about the concept of empathy, and I do it in a rather old-fashioned, very philosophical way. So it's going to be a talk, and it's going to be lots of philosophy, but I hope it will be helpful for our discussion that will continue in the next days. Empathies is the title of this conference, of our conference. And I like to emphasize that this conference is our conference, since the Society of Literature, Science and Arts Europe unites different fields, disciplines, practices, methods, approaches, orientations, backgrounds, preferences and values. In other words, the conference unites different perspectives on empathy. For the conference to succeed, we need a concentrated, concerted, flexible, and most of all, empathic effort to share our perspectives. I will talk about perspectives later, but let me first elaborate on the title of our conference. Empathies is a rather peculiar plural. It's even ungrammatical. But empathy comes in many forms and shapes, and complaints and about the conceptual diversity and confusion and the multiplicity of definitions of the empathy concept seem to be part and parcel of the research on and the discussions of empathy. So this is one reason for choosing the plural empathies, namely that there are many different concepts of empathy to be found. However, there is another reason for the plural empathies, this time not on the level of concept, but rather on the level of the phenomenon itself. Is empathy really one phenomenon? Is there really one unified thing called empathy? Or in other words, is empathy a natural kind? In philosophy, nouns that resist pluralization are called mass terms. Mass terms like water, milk, snow, grass, gold, anger, shame, honor, or prestige resist the grammatical plural. Another feature of mass terms is its cumulative reference. If you add water to water, gold to gold, or anger to anger, you will get more water, more gold, or more anger, but not waters, golds, or angers. On the other hand, concepts like bottle, dog, or coin do not resist the plural. They have what is called a divided reference, because you can refer to distinct entities by referring to bottles, stocks, and coins. In addition to that, mass terms suggest that there is something like a nature or an essence of the stuff designated by such a term. Stuff like water or milk quite naturally suggests that something is behind the stuff, something like a unifying essence. Water is trivially said to be H2O, and the chemical constitution of water seems to be responsible for certain laws holding of water. The same goes, say, for cow milk, which turns sour in certain conditions. But whatever you think about the essence or nature of chemical kinds like water or biological kinds like cow milk, the grammar and use of mass terms should not lead us easily astray when we turn to psychological kinds like anger or social kinds like honor. It's possible that we unite a rather heterogeneous bunch of things by the concept of anger, and it's very plausible that there is no such thing as the nature of honor that unites everything we were and are still inclined to classify as instances of honor. So despite the grammatical resistance to pluralization, therefore, we should not hesitate to introduce the plural here and think of angers and honors and other plurals. As soon as we introduce such a plural, suspicion kicks in. Is there really an essence of honor? No way. The suspicion suggests that empathy too doesn't have to have some kind of inner nature or unifying essence. In other words, it might be the case that empathy is not a natural kind. Despite the grammatical resistance to pluralization, we should not hesitate to talk of empathies if we are skeptical. Now, this train of thought becomes especially salient if we turn to contemporary discussions on empathy. In a recent article, the philosopher Joel Kruger concludes, and I quote, "Judging from the state of current research, the term empathy serves as an umbrella term for a relatively heterogeneous group of structures and processes that facilitate different facets of sociality and interpersonal understanding. As such, it is not clear that any single paradigm or disciplinary perspective will adequately capture all of its aspects." End of quote. So Kruger talks about a heterogeneous group of things, and he suggests that no single paradigm or perspective is able to capture all the relevant features of empathy. He indicates, in other words, the possibility that there might be pluralism not only on the conceptual level, but also on the ontological level, the level of the phenomenon. If empathy is an umbrella term, as Kruger suggests, there is reason to be pessimistic about our prospects of achieving different perspectives on one and the same thing. Because how could we talk about different perspectives if we have not one thing in view? These things called empathy, this is the nice title of an article written by Daniel Betzen in 2009. In this article, Betzen distinguishes several related but distinct phenomena that have been called, with some reason, empathy. For instance, the capacity to know what another person is thinking, desiring, believing, feeling, etc. is called empathy, cognitive empathy. Or the mechanisms that lead one person to respond with sensitivity to the suffering or the distress of another person is called empathy, affective empathy. There are many more concepts in play here. And moreover, concepts like distress, pity, role-taking, contagion, compassion, or sympathy are often associated or even identified with empathy. However, some progress can be made by carefully distinguishing the different but related things called empathy in order to tell a unified story about empathy that draws on the evidence about other mammals, especially the great apes, about neurological processes, and specifically about human psychological abilities and patterns. A largely consistent body of research has emerged, and there is some agreement on the existence of multiple overlapping but distinguishable empathic phenomena such as emotional contagion, sympathy, compassion, or cognitive empathy. The evidence from evolutionary biology, ethology, cognitive neuroscience, and social psychology suggests that there are different levels of empathy, that empathy is thus not an on or off phenomenon. There are intermediate forms between the extreme of mere agitation at the distress of another, found, for example, in rats and mice, and full understanding of the predicament other persons are in, found, for example, in humans, and I submit, in great apes as well. So we can impose some order on Kruger's relatively heterogeneous group of structures and processes, on the many things called empathy, by providing an overarching and structured account of the different levels of empathy. And bridging these levels holds the promise of achieving a better understanding of the complex phenomenon called empathy. This is the promise of the so-called social neurosciences, and Jean Dessetti will talk about this. Social neuroscience is an interdisciplinary field devoted to understanding how biological systems implement social processes and behavior. By combining research designs and behavioral measures used in social psychology with, say, neuroscience markers, social neuroscience can play an important role in disambiguating competing theories in empathy research. However, disagreement persists. Some of this disagreement derives from problems associated with the very concept of empathy. So on the ontological level, you can talk about this overlapping related phenomenon, but what about the concept itself? Last year, a group of psychologists from the UK provided a review of the concept of empathy in psychology. They found that there is a huge number of inconsistent definitions of empathy, and they came up with a list of 43 distinct definitions from the literature. They also claim that this fact has probably negative impact not only on the research concerning empathy, but also on the practices involving empathy, such as caretaking or education or furthering of humanitarian projects. Moreover, they identified several critical core issues in the debate about empathy. These core issues, I think, are very helpful in to understand the discussion that is going on, and I would like to point to 5 core issues that are debated in the literature on the psychology of empathy. The first question is, does the empathic emotion of the observer need to be congruent with the emotion of the observed individual or not? It is often assumed that empathy involves some kind of experience of someone else's experience by replicating or simulating the same experience or some analogue of the experience in the first person. However, by drawing on descriptions of empathy in the clinical practice of psychiatry, the philosopher Matthew Radcliffe has argued that the appreciation of difference is probably more central to empathy than the achievement of similarity. If the recognition of difference were sufficient for empathy, then empathy would be tied closely to non-congruent affective states. Here is a second issue. Is an emotion in another person or another animal really necessary for genuine empathy, or is empathy subject to other stimuli? When reading literature or watching movies, empathy with fictional characters seem essential. Yet fictional characters certainly don't undergo emotional and other psychological states. There are, after all, fictional characters. Rather, we imagine them to undergo such states. What's the difference here? The same goes for movies. Kim Novak's character experiences emotional states, but not necessarily Kim Novak herself. Here is a third issue, now concerning the individual, and there is the question whether empathy is a stable trait of a person or a stable character trait of an animal. The stable trait view implies that some individuals are more empathic than others, as it were by nature, and that this ability will be stable across time and different situations. The unlucky ones lack the character trait and they are not empathic. However, the position called situationism in social psychology has raised a number of serious doubts about stable character traits. And this suggests that empathic responses might be highly context-specific and dependent on the situation you're in, on the group you're responding to, on the group you're in, and other contexts. A number of situational features seem to influence empathic responding, such as similarity between observer and observed. That's a kind of a bias. The value an observer attaches to the observed, another bias. Or the mood you're in, or the situation of blame, or the perceived power or powerlessness of the other, or the perceived needs. A fourth issue concerns the question whether empathy necessarily has some kind of behavioral outcome. So is there some kind of action attached to empathy? Despite the fact that empathy is often followed by a behavioral response, this might not be an essential connection, but rather an association or a lucky coincidence. Thus the question is whether empathy is by its very nature tied to certain kinds of action. That's important for moral philosophy, for example. And finally, the fifth issue, are empathic responses automatic or controlled? Some neuroscientific evidence suggests that empathy is automatically activated upon perception of an emotional other. Yet empathy is a state we can reflect upon, control, and modify through reframing, suppression, or training. Empathy might be an achievement, a skill, something you can get better at. Now, all of these issues are under debate, and yet they aim at the very heart of the concept of empathy. Now, I ask you to imagine two voices proposing different theories of empathy articulated along the lines of the core issues I just mentioned. Imagine the first voice saying, empathy is a stable and automatic effective response to a congruent emotion in another person with no specific behavioral outcome whatsoever. I think Friedrich Nietzsche had this kind of. That's why Nietzsche thought that, morally speaking, empathy is not a very laudable and useful trait. Quite the opposite. According to Nietzsche, empathy, like compassion or pity, is expressive of a weak and unstable personality, lacking autonomy and self-esteem, reproducing real or imaginary negative emotions and distress, and thus reproducing imaginary and real suffering without the slightest idea of how to change the causes of the negative emotions and suffering. For Nietzsche, empathy is nothing but the self-indulgent state of mind of certain weak types of character that simply cannot help being affected by negativity in general. Now imagine a second voice. Empathy is a highly context-sensitive and controllable reaction involving both affective and cognitive states, integrating first and third-person perspectives, sometimes congruent with others, sometimes open to very incongruent states and even to very alien ways of perceiving the world, however, with no specific behavioral outcome whatsoever. Now, despite the fact that empathy has no specific behavioral outcome according to it might be a very valuable means for learning about others through real-life experience or through fictional encounters. Empathy enlarges our perception of others and the perceptions of the situations they are in to an astonishing degree. From this perspective, empathy holds out the welcome promise of enlarging our own view on the world. And yet, it might nonetheless be morally neutral. Take the example of the character of O'Brien in George Orwell's novel 1984. O'Brien is a very sophisticated, cultivated, and highly empathic person. He takes a deep interest in the novel's hero, Winston Smith. He takes a deep interest in the novel's hero, Winston Smith.